It all started on a plane that seemed ordinary at first. Passengers were settling into their seats, some chatting quietly, some flipping through magazines, and others already drifting into the hum of the engines. No one had any idea that a very famous actor was on board, quietly taking his seat like any other traveler. He didn't make a scene or draw attention to himself, which was exactly how he liked it. He just wanted a peaceful flight. Sitting a few rows away was a wealthy businessman, dressed in an expensive suit, clearly used to getting whatever he wanted. He was loud and confident, the kind of person who assumed his money gave him the right to behave however he pleased. From the moment he boarded, he seemed to enjoy showing off, speaking over people, and acting like he owned the plane. He criticized the staff, rolled his eyes at other passengers, and made a few sarcastic remarks about Hollywood types in general. At first, people ignored him, thinking it was best not to engage. But the businessman didn't notice that one of his fellow passengers was Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly, observing everything. Keanu had a way of noticing people's behavior without making it obvious. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand respect. He could see everything: the arrogance, the impatience, the small insults hidden in words meant to make others feel small. The businessman, completely unaware of who Keanu was, continued. He leaned back in his seat, laughing loudly at his own jokes, and even mimicked a few gestures in an exaggerated way. It was clear he enjoyed being the center of attention. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, hoping he would calm down. One flight attendant approached him politely, asking if he needed anything, but he waved her off and made another sarcastic comment. Keanu didn't say anything at first. He remained calm, watching quietly, letting the businessman show his true colors. There was no anger in his eyes, just understanding. He could have confronted him right away, but he knew that sometimes people reveal their real selves when they think no one is paying attention. Keanu wanted to see how far it would go. The tension in the cabin grew slowly. Passengers started whispering to each other, noticing the businessman's behavior and wondering how long it would take before someone spoke up. They couldn't know that the quiet observer a few rows away had already made up his mind. He didn't need to yell or confront him immediately. Keanu believed in handling situations with calm, quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself with volume or anger. As the plane cruised higher into the sky, the businessman finally noticed Keanu looking in his direction. He squinted and gave a dismissive nod, assuming the actor was just another passenger. He didn't know that his arrogance was being quietly measured, not with judgment but with understanding. Keanu's calm presence made the businessman slightly uneasy without him even realizing it. There was something about the way Keanu carried himself, simple, unassuming, yet undeniably strong, that made the businessman pause for just a moment. That moment was small, almost invisible, but it was the beginning of something bigger. The businessman had no idea that his next few hours on the plane would be unlike anything he had ever experienced. The quiet, unassuming man sitting a few rows away was about to teach him a lesson in humility, respect, and the true meaning of strength. Keanu continued to watch, not to embarrass or humiliate, but to observe. He could tell when someone was acting out of insecurity, when arrogance was just a mask for fear or discomfort. And he could see clearly that the businessman was wearing that mask, thinking it made him powerful. Little did he know, real power doesn't come from money, status, or loudness. It comes from how you treat people, especially those who can't give you anything in return. As the flight moved forward, the businessman leaned back in his seat, laughing at his own jokes, completely unaware of the lesson quietly unfolding right in front of him. Passengers tried to ignore him, but the tension in the air was noticeable. Something was about to happen, something that would leave everyone on the plane, including the businessman himself, stunned. Keanu remained calm. He didn't need to show off or prove anything. His calmness and patience were more powerful than any argument. And as the businessman continued to speak without thinking, he was unknowingly walking straight into a moment that would change him forever. The first part of this story wasn't just about disrespect. It was about the way true character can quietly shine, even when confronted with arrogance. As the flight went on, the businessman's behavior became more noticeable. At first, passengers had tried to ignore him, thinking he would calm down. But his arrogance seemed to grow with every passing hour. He criticized the in-flight service loudly, complaining about the food, the seats, and even the way the flight attendants walked down the aisle. He made jokes at the expense of other travelers, smirking whenever someone looked uncomfortable. Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly a few rows away, watched it all with calm attention. He didn't interrupt or argue, but he could feel the tension building in the cabin. It wasn't just the businessman's words, it was the energy he brought with him. Some passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to one another about how rude he was being. A couple of people shot him nervous glances, hoping he might notice how uncomfortable he was making everyone. The businessman, of course, did not notice. He was too focused on being the center of attention, laughing at his own jokes and acting as if the plane belonged to him. He leaned back, arms spread, looking around to see if anyone was impressed by his behavior. He clearly expected admiration for his wealth and confidence. But there was no admiration here, only quiet frustration and awkward tension. Keanu remained calm, observing quietly. He knew that anger or confrontation wouldn't solve anything. Sometimes people reveal who they really are when they think no one is watching closely. And the businessman was doing exactly that, showing his true self without realizing it. Keanu could see that his arrogance was masking insecurity. It wasn't confidence, it was fear disguised as pride. The flight attendants were already aware of the situation. One approached politely to ask if he needed anything, and he waved her off with a dismissive comment, smirking like he had just delivered a clever joke. Another passenger tried to intervene, offering a friendly suggestion about keeping the noise down, and the businessman scoffed. He seemed almost immune to reason, used to people bending to his will because of his wealth and status. Even as he continued, there were small cracks beginning to show. Every now and then his smirk faltered when he noticed Keanu watching. He didn't recognize him, but there was something in Keanu's quiet gaze that made him feel slightly unsettled. It wasn't fear or anger, it was calm confidence. The kind of confidence that doesn't need to raise its voice to be noticed. It made the businessman pause, just for a fraction of a second. Before returning to his arrogant performance, passengers began paying closer attention, realizing there was someone else on the plane besides the businessman. Whispers started circulating. "Is that? I think it might be him." People leaned closer to get a better look, trying to figure out if it was really the famous actor they all knew from movies. Some were excited, some were nervous. They could sense a story unfolding that they wouldn't forget. Despite all the chaos, Keanu stayed calm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't roll his eyes, and didn't make a scene. He simply continued observing, letting the businessman speak without interruption. There was a lesson hidden in that calmness, a quiet strength that the businessman didn't understand yet. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about showing that respect and humility carried more weight than wealth or status. The businessman continued, unaware of the growing tension around him. He made a sarcastic comment about actors in general, mocking them as though they were all spoiled and unworthy of admiration. Some passengers flinched, but Keanu just looked at him quietly, letting the words hang in the air. There was no embarrassment, no anger, only calm observation. That quiet reaction made the businessman feel a little off balance. He wasn't used to being ignored when he tried to dominate the room, or in this case. The plane. Time passed slowly, each moment stretching longer as the businessman continued to show his arrogance. But the calmness of Keanu and the growing awareness of the other passengers began to shift the energy on the plane. People were no longer just uncomfortable, they were watching, silently rooting for some kind of lesson to unfold. They could feel that something important was about to happen, something that would humble the businessman without anyone needing to raise their voice. As the plane cruised through the sky, the businessman finally leaned back, laughing at his own remarks, completely unaware of the impact his behavior was having not just on the passengers but on himself. Little did he know, the quiet presence a few rows away was already preparing to address the situation in a way that no amount of arrogance could ignore. Keanu didn't need to speak yet. His calm, patient demeanor was already sending a message. Real power is quiet. Real strength doesn't shout, it observes, understands, and waits for the right moment. And as the businessman continued to dominate the cabin with his behavior, the moment was approaching. A moment that would change the course of the flight and teach a lesson that money could never buy. The atmosphere was charged, but not with anger. It was charged with anticipation. Everyone on the plane could feel that this was not going to be an ordinary flight. The businessman, caught in his own arrogance, had no idea what was coming. But Keanu, quiet and composed, was about to show him that true respect and humility were far more powerful than arrogance or wealth. The flight was more than halfway over, and the businessman's behavior had grown louder and more aggressive. He criticized every minor thing around him: the food, the way the flight attendants moved, even the way other passengers were sitting. His arrogance was impossible to ignore now. People were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some trying not to stare, others whispering quietly to their neighbors. But the businessman didn't notice. He thought he was entertaining everyone with his jokes and comments. Keanu Reeves, who had been watching quietly all along, finally decided it was time to act. But his approach was not aggressive or angry. He didn't raise his voice and he didn't try to embarrass the businessman. Instead, he waited for a moment when the man had paused for a sip of his drink. Calmly, Keanu leaned forward slightly and spoke, his voice gentle but firm. He asked the businessman to consider the way he was speaking to others and reminded him that respect is more valuable than wealth or status. The businessman froze. He had not expected anyone to speak to him this way, and certainly not so calmly. At first, he tried to brush it off with a nervous chuckle. "Oh, come on, I'm just joking," he said, hoping to regain control of the situation. But Keanu's quiet confidence made it clear that this was not a joke. There was no anger, no hostility, just a simple truth delivered with clarity. The businessman's usual arrogance started to falter. Passengers on the plane began to notice the interaction. Whispers spread quickly. Some were holding their breath, curious to see what would happen next. Others were surprised by Keanu's calm authority. He didn't need to raise his voice or use dramatic gestures. His presence alone was commanding attention. And the businessman was beginning to realize that his usual tactics of dominance wouldn't work here. The businessman tried to recover, making another sarcastic comment about actors and Hollywood personalities. He assumed that the calmness of Keanu was a weakness he could exploit. But Keanu didn't respond with anger or insult. Instead, he calmly explained that real power and strength come from kindness and respect, not from money, status, or loudness. He gave examples in a simple, human way, stories about people helping others, about the value of humility, and about how arrogance only isolates a person from genuine connection. The businessman, stunned, had no response. He had never been spoken to like this before. His usual confidence and quick wit were nowhere to be found. He opened his mouth a few times, trying to say something clever, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, he felt completely unarmed. There was no argument he could make to regain his superiority, no joke he could tell to bring the attention back to himself. He was speechless. Keanu's calm words continued to sink in, not just for the businessman, but for everyone else on the plane. Passengers began to feel a sense of relief and admiration. They could see that the situation was being handled with grace, not aggression. Keanu was showing a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. The kind that commands respect naturally. The businessman finally leaned back in his seat, silent, trying to process what had just happened. He was humiliated, not through anger or shouting, but through quiet, undeniable truth. The passengers could sense the shift in energy on the plane. What had started as an uncomfortable, tense flight was now turning into a powerful lesson in humility. Keanu didn't continue to lecture. Once he had made his point, he returned to his quiet demeanor. He didn't need to prove anything further. The businessman, still stunned, sat in silence, realizing that his arrogance had not only failed to impress anyone, but had also exposed his true insecurities. The contrast between Keanu's calm confidence and his own loud arrogance was impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely. Passengers who had been nervous or annoyed earlier now felt a sense of respect and admiration for the quiet strength that Keanu had shown. And the businessman, who had believed that his wealth and status made him untouchable, had finally encountered someone whose quiet presence spoke louder than any display of arrogance. By the time the plane reached its cruising altitude, it was clear that this was no ordinary flight. The businessman was no longer the center of attention, and for the first time, he was forced to reflect on his behavior. Keanu had shown, without anger or force, that true respect comes from humility and kindness, and that arrogance, no matter how wealthy or powerful the person, could not stand against it. After the initial confrontation, the businessman was silent, still trying to process what had just happened. He had never been spoken to in such a calm, firm way before. Usually, people either laughed at his arrogance or avoided him altogether. But here, on this plane, he had been faced with something entirely different: quiet strength. He could feel a strange mix of frustration, embarrassment, and confusion building inside him. Keanu Reeves didn't push further. He didn't shout, argue, or humiliate him. Instead, he began to share something deeper, almost like telling a story to someone who needed to hear it. He spoke about the importance of humility and respect, not in a preachy way, but in simple, relatable words. He explained that wealth or fame could never replace genuine kindness. A person might have power, money, or influence, but if they treated others poorly, none of it really mattered. The businessman listened, though he tried not to show it. He had spent his life thinking that confidence came from being loud, assertive, and in control. But here was a man who commanded attention without raising his voice. Every word Keanu spoke seemed to carry more weight than the businessman had ever experienced. There was no anger, no ego, just honesty. Delivered with patience and clarity, passengers nearby started to pay closer attention. It wasn't every day that they witnessed a confrontation handled with such grace. They noticed the businessman shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his smug expression slowly fading as he listened. Some of them quietly hoped that he would take the lesson to heart, realizing that humility could change the way he interacted with the world. Keanu continued, sharing examples of simple human decency. He talked about times when helping someone, even when no one was watching, had created a ripple effect of goodness. He mentioned small acts of kindness that cost nothing but could mean everything to someone else. The businessman, still sitting stiffly, began to feel an unusual stirring inside him. He wasn't used to hearing the truth delivered without judgment, without sarcasm, without the desire to punish. It was disarming. At first, the businessman tried to interrupt, saying things like, "I don't need lectures," or "I've built my life my way." But Keanu listened patiently, not dismissing him or escalating the tension. Instead, he responded calmly, gently explaining that everyone's life has lessons to teach, no matter how much money or power they have. Real strength comes from learning, growing, and treating people with respect. The businessman fell silent again. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own arrogance. He realized that his behavior had not only made others uncomfortable, but had also isolated him. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself, thinking it was all about power and status, that he had forgotten how to connect with people on a human level. Keanu's words made him confront a truth he had avoided for years. The passengers could see the change happening slowly. The businessman's posture softened. His face showed hesitation and thoughtfulness. He wasn't smiling yet, and he wasn't apologizing, but there was a crack in his armor. Keanu's quiet authority had worked. Without anger or humiliation, he had reached the man in a way that no argument or insult ever could. Keanu didn't push for apologies or try to force a change. He simply spoke about life and respect, letting his words do the work. The businessman sat quietly, reflecting on everything he had said. It was a moment of self-realization, the kind that doesn't always come easily. He realized that being wealthy and powerful didn't give him the right to disrespect anyone. He saw how much stronger a person could be when they treated others with kindness. Even in situations where they could act however they pleased. By the time the flight was nearing its midpoint, the businessman's energy had shifted completely. The arrogance, the loudness, the need to dominate had all faded. He no longer felt like the center of attention, and for the first time, he felt the discomfort of being in the presence of someone who was truly confident without needing to prove it. Keanu had not only defended the dignity of others, but had also shown him the meaning of true respect and humility. Passengers began to feel a sense of relief and admiration. They realized they had witnessed something rare, a confrontation handled with wisdom, patience, and humanity. Keanu had taught a powerful lesson without raising his voice or humiliating anyone. And for the businessman, it was a lesson that would linger long after the plane landed. As the flight continued, the businessman remained quiet, reflecting on what had just happened. He hadn't fully processed it yet, but a seed had been planted, a realization that wealth and status alone were not enough. True respect, kindness, and humility were far more valuable, and no amount of money could replace them. Keanu had shown him this simply by being calm, observant, and honest. The rest of the passengers watched quietly, sensing the subtle shift in energy. What had begun as a tense, uncomfortable flight was now turning into a story about transformation. The businessman, who had entered the plane thinking he was in control, had learned a lesson that no boardroom or bank account could teach. And all of this had happened through quiet words, calm observation, and the simple, undeniable power of human decency. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed. The businessman, who had started the flight loud and arrogant, was now quiet and reflective. He hadn't spoken much since Keanu had shared his simple but powerful words about respect, humility, and kindness. His usual confidence and bravado had been replaced by something unfamiliar, thoughtfulness, and a hint of self-awareness. Passengers who had been nervous or annoyed at the start of the flight now watched in quiet curiosity. They could see the subtle shift in the businessman's demeanor. He no longer laughed loudly at his own jokes or rolled his eyes at the staff. Instead, he seemed to be thinking deeply about what he had heard. For many of the passengers, this transformation was remarkable. They had been expecting a tense, uncomfortable flight, but instead, they witnessed a lesson in human decency and humility. Keanu remained calm, his quiet presence unchanging. He didn't need to comment further because his message had already been received. He continued to sit quietly, reading a book and occasionally looking out the window. His patience and composure had done more than any harsh words or confrontation could have. The businessman had learned the lesson through observation, reflection, and the gentle but firm way Keanu had spoken to him. The businessman finally took a deep breath and looked around. He realized that he had treated others poorly, assuming that his wealth and power made him superior. He now understood that this approach didn't earn him respect. It only isolated him. People may have been polite to him out of courtesy, but genuine respect was something else entirely. And Keanu had just shown him, without anger or insult, what real respect looked like. For the first time, the businessman felt a sense of humility. He noticed the flight attendants moving gracefully down the aisle, serving passengers who had once seemed beneath his notice. He thought about how he had treated them earlier, with impatience and sarcasm. He felt a twinge of guilt, but also a spark of understanding. He realized that real strength wasn't about being loud or demanding. It was about being kind and considerate. Even when no one was watching, the passengers began to relax, sensing the shift in energy. Some smiled quietly, feeling relief that the tension had passed. Others whispered to one another, sharing how unusual and inspiring it was to witness a confrontation handled with calm and dignity. It was clear that everyone on the plane had learned something from the encounter, not just the businessman. They had seen firsthand how patience, humility, and respect could change the tone of a situation completely. As the plane touched down, the businessman remained in his seat, taking in the moment. He didn't rush off or try to regain his former arrogance. Instead, he stayed thoughtful, replaying Keanu's words in his mind. He understood that he had been given a rare opportunity to learn something valuable. Not everyone gets a lesson like this delivered so directly, without embarrassment or humiliation, and yet so clearly. Keanu quietly stood, gathered his belongings, and prepared to leave the plane. He didn't make a scene or demand attention. He simply smiled politely at the passengers and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a calm, respectful energy that lingered in the cabin. The businessman watched him go, still silent, but now carrying a new sense of awareness. He had been humbled but not humiliated, and that made the lesson all the more powerful. The businessman realized that he had a choice. He could continue living the way he had before, letting arrogance and entitlement guide his actions. Or he could take this experience as a turning point, an opportunity to treat people with respect, kindness, and humility. For the first time, he seriously considered the second option. He understood that true power wasn't measured by money or status, but by how you made others feel and how you carried yourself in everyday life. As passengers disembarked, there was a quiet sense of reflection throughout the cabin. People smiled politely at each other, and some even nodded toward the businessman, who now appeared more grounded and thoughtful. He didn't speak much, but his actions showed that he had been changed by the encounter. It was clear to everyone that the flight had been more than a simple journey from one place to another. It had become a lesson in human decency and the importance of humility. Even after leaving the plane, the businessman couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He replayed the calm, firm words of Keanu Reeves in his mind, reflecting on the way he had acted and the way he should act moving forward. He understood now that respect and kindness weren't weaknesses, they were strengths that had the power to change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. And in that quiet reflection, he realized something else. Sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from force, argument, or confrontation. They come from patience, observation, and the quiet demonstration of integrity and humility. Keanu had taught him this without anger or spectacle, and that made the lesson unforgettable. By the time he left the airport, the businessman felt lighter. The arrogance and need to dominate had faded. He understood that real respect could not be demanded, it had to be earned, and it began with how you treat others. The flight had been an uncomfortable experience at first, but it ended as a transformative moment, one that would stay with him for a long time. The passengers, too, carried the memory with them. They had witnessed something rare, a person humbled by quiet, calm wisdom rather than anger or confrontation. And for the businessman, this experience became a turning point, a reminder that humility, kindness, and respect are more valuable than money, power, or status. The flight ended, but the lesson remained. A simple journey had turned into a story about transformation, reflection, and the quiet power of human decency. The businessman had left the plane a changed man, carrying with him a new understanding of what it truly means to be strong, confident, and respected.